Good morning. We're so glad to welcome you to Kansas State University and to our 14th annual Huck Boyd Lecture in Community Media. The Huck Boyd Center is part of the A.Q. Miller School of Journalism and Mass Communications. K-State has been celebrating its 150th birthday this entire year, and this week, homecoming week, is the grand finale of sesquicentennial events. So we decided to join the celebration by having Jane P. Marshall talk about her book, Tea Time to Tailgates, 150 Years at the K-State Table. Jane grew up in the Kansas Flint Hills, where she plowed and baled hay before tractors had computers and air conditioning. Jane was features editor at major newspapers in Fort Worth, Denver, and Houston, and she wrote about food for the New York Times newspaper group. Currently, she is the communications coordinator for the College of Human Ecology, and she also teaches food writing. I'd like to thank the College of Human Ecology for sharing Jane with us and for publishing this fun book. Quote, the story of gritty professors, itchy-footed explorers, and talented graduates who changed the world by changing how people grow, select, prepare, and eat their food. The story of K-State's rich food heritage leads from Kansas to the world, from tea time to tailgates. And I just want to tell you that I bought 4 copies of Jane's book, 1 for myself and 3 Christmas gifts. So she is going to be signing books after the lecture. In conjunction with the lecture, we're also hosting our 8th annual Great Plains Radio History Symposium from 1 to 5 p.m. In the Hemisphere Room of Hale Library. I'd like to thank the Huck Boyd National Institute for Rural Development and the K-State Libraries for being co-sponsors of that event. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit about MacDill Huck Boyd. He loved community newspapering. After studying briefly at Kansas State, he went home to Phillipsburg in northwest Kansas. Through his Phillips County Review, he bettered his community by helping retain rail service to the area and by ensuring that his community had health care, among other endeavors. His philosophy was, community service is the rent you pay for the privilege of living on this earth. Our center, named to honor Huck Boyd, believes that community media are the glue that hold their communities together. This lecture series is one way by which we can honor Huck and showcase the importance of community journalism. I'd like to thank Birgit Vasmuth, the new director of the A.Q. Miller School, for her support, Boyd family members, including Huck Boyd's granddaughter, Ann Brockhoff, and Frank Boyd's grandson, Steve Logback, who are in the audience here somewhere. I'd also like to thank the Huck Boyd patrons who are listed in the program. Without their support, this lecture series would not be possible. Members of the media, K-State faculty, staff, and students, and the Manhattan community for being here today. Please help me welcome Jane P. Marshall as she talks about Wildcats, newspapers, and mulberry pie, stories from the kitchen table.
Well, so far I haven't fallen down. There are 2 ways to pick mulberries for mulberry pie. Nell Nichols, who graduated in 1916, wrote this: the recipe for mulberry pie properly starts. Select a sunny, summery day when the breezes are light. Stand on the shady side of a mulberry tree and fill your pail with knobby, long, glistening berries. However, if you are of a different berry-picking school, spread a warm sheet on the emerald grass beneath the tree, shake the branches lightly, and run from the shower of juicy, warm, sweet berries as they plop down. That's the way Nichols starts her recipe for mulberry pie, page 16, Tea Time to Tailgates. It was published in the Farm Journal Country Cookbook in 1959. This morning, I am talking about Wildcats, like Nell Nichols, and journalism graduates and others who went out into the world and affected the way people cooked, ate, and made their food choices. I'm going to talk about newspapers, the spirit they evoke in a community, especially when they write about food. But this part of the talk is about pie. During the 150th anniversary kickoff this spring, I attended a tiny gathering of two very powerful, very successful women graduates. The menu was simple: fried chicken and pie. I firmly believe that if Kansans looked deep into their heart and were very truthful with themselves, they would agree that this is the perfect menu. Maybe steak and pie, but pie, always pie. My contribution to this spring supper was buttermilk pie, and I do make a mean buttermilk pie. One of the women, Gail McClure, looked at the pie and said, "My grandmother used to make buttermilk pie." Gail grew up in Lyons, Kansas. She was in charge of a big chunk of the Kellogg Foundation, and she led programs all over the world. She is very cool, very smart, and there she was crying over my buttermilk pie. We sent her back to the Garden Inn with pie for breakfast. Point number one, food and the memories associated with them touches people's lives. Like food, newspapers also touch people's lives in a way that nothing else can. I'm going to interrupt myself for a second here to thank you all for coming, and to thank Gloria for inviting me, and to the journalism and mass communications folks for perpetuating this lecture series. I feel honored and awed to be up here instead of at my usual seat back in the audience of the Huck Boyd lecture. And thanks to the Huck Boyd family and friends. Now, I never met Huck Boyd, but I feel like I know his mom a little. Mamie Boyd is a K-State legend. She is also pages 62 and 63 in Tea Time for Tailgates. I would have loved to have met her to talk about newspapers and families as she sat knitting. We probably wouldn't have talked much about food because I got the impression that she had too much else to do than to take time to cook supper every evening. But I'm awed by her energy and her commitment and her wit. She once wrote, "When I work hard. When I sit down easy. And when I worry, I go to sleep." One of my gifts in moving back to Kansas was becoming friends with her great-granddaughter and Huck Boyd's granddaughter, Ann Brockhoff, who is one of the best food journalists that I know. Now, community journalism had a whole different meaning when I graduated from K-State in the days of hot type and Rolodexes and electric typewriters. The part of community journalism was what we called reader participation. We asked readers for their opinion, and then we published them in the paper. When I was at the Houston Chronicle, we did a lot of these. They were very trendy at the time, and one of my favorites was about pie. It wasn't an ordinary pie contest. People had to send in their pie recipes and then send in the stories that went with the pie recipes, and the stories and the pie were judged equally. We were shocked by the response and ended up devoting 2 weeks of food sections to the contest. The stories were funny and they were sad, they were uplifting. You'd be surprised how many involved recipes of husband's favorite recipe given by mother-in-law to new bride with ingredients missing. It's just a little too close to home for some people. One story involved a pie that fell on the kitchen floor, was scooped back up into the pie pan and delivered to the table. The upside-down pie evolved into a tradition in that family. My favorite of the winning stories was by John James Nash, the guy leaning against the red barn. His story went like this. Years ago, all ranch work was done on horseback. One day, long ago, when I was a lad of 8 or 10, in the course of searching for stray cattle, I came to Aunt Polly's house at mid-afternoon. She lived alone in a small cabin far back in the pasture. She tended a milk cow and some chickens and a pig or two. A large garden made her almost self-sufficient. She invited me in and fed me a steaming cup of coffee and a slab of vinegar pie. That remains one of the most memorable meals I have ever eaten. Aunt Polly could not afford canned fruit, and when fresh fruit was out of season, she sometimes longed for the tartness of a fruit pie. Vinegar pie was her substitute. There is no substitute for the generosity of an old woman who was short on world goods, but long on love for her neighbors. I received the recipe from Aunt Polly. It was measured in handsfuls. It took me some time to work out the kitchen measures. I still make this old-time pie once in a while to remind me of times long past and people long departed. Times hard and good when horizons were far and people were close. These stories were not about pies. They were about people, and they were people things, like friendship, revenge, hope, thanksgiving, war, peace, success, mishaps. But mostly they were stories about love. Mark Kurlinski wrote this: "There is simply no better way for a writer to approach the fundamental subject of the human condition than to talk about the food that we choose to ingest." That is what Tea Time to Tailgates is all about, people. It's community journalism in a community that is small and enormous. I call it a history story recipe book, but it's also a thank you book. It's a salute to those on whose shoulders we stand, those men and women who built community, raised their families, established businesses. They were the caretakers of the intellectual and the environmental community. Still, they took time to grasp the world by the horns and to make a difference in how people eat and what they eat. In Chapter 1, Tea Time on the Frontier's Edge, we have the stories of grasshoppers and droughts, of tornadoes and blizzards, the story of men and women who appreciated the horizon, the land, a good education, and a good loaf of bread. From the frontier's edge to the sesquicentennial celebration 150 years later, Kansas State graduates have used their education to feed and nurture families and communities. They've used it to build economies and cities and better mousetraps, to educate the next generation for the challenges ahead. Wherever they landed, they kept the memories of the food that they ate and the friends that they made here in Manhattan. Sometimes what we remember and cherish is not the food itself, but all the bonds and memories that those foods represent. That's point 2. Okay. Like my grandmother's watermelon pickles, page 77. Like Myrna Ziegler's K-State crowns at the Union, page 165. Like the letter that Julie Migley sent to me, which was really a love letter to Kansas dirt that is still served at the Derby Dining Center. And that recipe is on page 162. This book started out a couple of years when I walked into Dean Virginia Moxley's office and said, "Human ecology needs to have a sesquicentennial project, something that can be our contribution to the occasion." I handed her a list. She pointed to one of the items and said, "Go." Tea Time to Tailgates was born. For months, I read books, newspapers, diaries. I even combed through some USDA files in Washington. I interviewed, I searched, I tested recipes, I proofread, I tested more recipes. did more proofreading. I asked faculty and staff and students and alumni to share recipes and stories, and they did. I asked dining services to whittle their recipes that fed hundreds down to family size, and they did. I asked, and beseeched is probably a better word here, the archivists at Hale Library and the Riley County Historical Society for help, and they rescued me time and again. Here is how one of those searches turned out. The conversation went like this. Me, a graduate told me about taking a class in which they made grasshopper cookies. Do you have that recipe? Entomologist, his name's Greg Zolnerwich. That most likely was a class of Hugh Thompson, who was an advocate of using insects as food. He's retired. I don't make grasshopper cookies. Me, entomologist, but I do make chocolate chip cricket cookies. I use the basic recipe on the Toll House chocolate chip package and add 100 to 120 dried roasted crickets to the dough. It's pretty simple. Me, where do you get roasted crickets? Entomologist, you can order live crickets online or go to a pet store. You have to be cautious roasting them. Once I had headless crickets hopping all over my oven, so I'm more careful now. He proceeded to describe the cricket roasting process, and I immediately decided that the instructions for roasting crickets would not see the light of day in this book. But I did want the cookie recipe. Me, I would love to use your cricket cookie recipe. The only other unusual one in the book is roasted raccoon. And the entomologist said, raccoon? People eat raccoon? The recipe's in the book for roasted cricket. I call them chocolate chirp cookies. Okay. In the early days, before chocolate chirp cookies, the domestic science class was in charge of food, from student meals on campus to Board of Regent meetings. At one of those meetings in 1887, the students fixed the following, and this is a quote from President Anderson. The first course was delicately flavored soup, as good as any you ever tasted. It was followed by roast beef, Irish potatoes boiled, ditto fried, sweet potatoes boiled, jellied beef, and cold roast pork. The dessert, which would charm both the epicure and the dyspeptic, consisted of Union pie, Washington pie, a very nice apple something or other, 2 or 3 kinds of cakes, coffee, and apples. And I think, how Kansan, 3 meats, 3 potatoes, 6 desserts. Together, the information that I gathered formed a picture of the rich food heritage of the nation's first land-grant institution, a heritage that frankly stunned me with its depth. Throughout its existence, K-State has helped set the table of the world with its research, with its hearty influence of faculty and graduates who are dietitians, chefs, writers, restaurateurs, extension agents, teachers, agronomists, cattlemen, farmers, and much, much more. And standing in the middle of all this food commotion, more times than not, is a person with a reporter's notebook. These food writers and journalists guide, inform, and entertain those of us who put the soup on the table and those of us who put the soup spoon to mouth. A handful of these food missionaries have K-State roots. Probably the most famous and well-known and most prominent of the bunch is Clementine Paddleford. She was a 1921 industrial journalism graduate and was called the world's most influential food writer during the 40s and the 50s. At one time, she had an estimated, you ready for this? 12 million readers, 12 million readers. Okay. Paddleford, many people call her Clem, grew up in Stockdale, which is now under the waters of Tuttle Creek Reservoir. She nearly disappeared from the American mind until Hale Library revived interest in her. A symposium in 2005, on the anniversary of her birthday, celebrated the food journalist and the collection that she donated to the Morse Department of Special Collections. The event spawned a story in the New York Times by A.J. Apple, who is a seasoned political and international journalist turned food journalist. His story, called the most famous food writer you never heard of, kindled a spark that became a fire. In Severe magazine, Kelly Alexander wrote, Paddleford was arguably the first journalist to call attention to the fact that there was a rich tradition of good eating on these American shores, a tradition worth preserving and building on. And it all started in Kansas. Alexander and Cynthia Harris collaborated on Hometown Appetites, which was published in 2008. Harris curated the library's entire Paddleford collection, all 363 boxes of it. It took 3.5 years. In 1924, Paddleford was woman's editor of a magazine called Farm and Fireside in New York. She later wrote for the New York Herald Tribune, the World Journal Tribune, This Week magazine, and Gourmet magazine. She also wrote several cookbooks and a stirring little tribute called A Flower to My Mother, for my mother. Her columns exemplified Paddleford's passion for food and for adventure. She was powerfully curious. She ferreted out stories about submarines at Spanish olive harvest during the Queen Elizabeth's coronation celebrations in 1953, and in Kansas farmhouses. Jenny Paddleford, who attended K-State in 1883, taught her daughter many lessons, including the joy of feeding the family and of eating together. But the most impressionable one was this, and this is my favorite one: never grow a wishbone where your backbone should be. Although Clementine Paddleford lived in New York City and traveled the world, she never forgot that backbone, and she never forgot her Kansas roots. In A Flower for My Mother, she wrote this: It was in a yellow limestone church in Stockdale, Kansas, a crossroads town, that I sat dreaming during summer Sunday sermons, not of heaven or hell, but of the good dinner to come. Her Sunday dinner symbolized good food that was homegrown, home-cooked, seasonal, and shared. Nell Nichols had her of the roasted raccoon recipe. Nell Nichols had her hands in more than two dozen cookbooks. Like Paddleford, she collected and published recipes from many sources, and most of hers came from farm journal readers. She grew up on a ranch near Dodge City. Her high school class had 12 students, and in high school she studied Latin and German. She graduated from K-State in 1916 with a degree in home economics, and she wanted to combine that with journalism. They hadn't done that at the time, so she headed to the University of Wisconsin. Farm and Fireside magazine hired her as a field editor in 1920. Later, she joined Women's Home Companion and then the Farm Journal. Kathleen Kelly, I'm sure some of you knew her. Kathleen Kelly, with a fresh degree in home economics and journalism, went to work for the Wichita Eagle Beacon in 1955, and she stayed there for 40 years. She was called an icon in Kansas journalism and an exuberant spirit. She retired from journalism in 1995, telling the Wichita Eagle readers, "We've broken bread, harvested persimmons, licked bowls, stuffed sausages, tied comforts. We have explored whipped cream and chocolate, organ meats and oat bran with equal abandon. We've traveled the world, and best of all, we've gotten into the nooks and crannies of Kansas." She brought a lot of culture to the Plains, wrote one of her co-workers. Kelly traveled to cooking schools in Paris and Hong Kong. She learned about Thai cooking in Bangkok. She spent days with Simone Beck in France. And with each of her journeys, she brought back recipes for her Kansas readers. Hers are two of my favorite in the book. She has a recipe for microwave pickles and one for rhubarb quick bread. Shirley Sarvis graduated from K-State in home economics in 1957. She was a food writer, a cookbook author, and an acknowledged pioneer in the art of food and wine pairing, one of the first people to ever write about that topic. She critically examined why food and wine matched or didn't match. She died this year in San Francisco. She understood, one writer explained, that wine was not about pretentiousness, but it was there to help us slow down and get in touch with our souls. A San Francisco chef said of her talent, she had a really rare palate out of the stratosphere in terms of her ability to taste. Ms. Sarvis was born in Norton, Kansas in 1935, and she worked at Sunset Magazine, Travel and Leisure, Women's Day, Food and Wine, Gourmet, and other magazines, and she worked on about a dozen cookbooks. Jane Butel graduated from K-State with a degree in home economics and journalism in 1959, and after carrying hefty positions such as vice president of American Express in New York, she became a devotee of Chile and its accompanying cuisines. Often credited with starting the Southwestern cooking craze, she's written more than 20 books, and she now still operates a cooking school in New Mexico. She offered her recipe for a bowl of red, which you'll find in Tea Time to Tailgates, and the recipe, she said, was inspired by her maternal grandfather, who learned to make it from trail cooks. It's one of her trademark recipes, and she recently left all of her papers, or donated all of her papers to the special collections in Hale 2. Janet Helm combined degrees in journalism and dietetics to create a career as a nutrition communicator. A registered nutrition, she is one of the chief strategists in North America for Weber Shandwick in Chicago, and helped with such campaigns as the Got Milk Mustache campaign. My passion, she says, is translating nutrition science to intelligible words and healthy food choices. She founded the Nutrition Blog Network for Dietitians. She blogs regularly. She writes for WebMD, and until recently had a column in the Chicago Tribune. Michael Bauer, you'll know why I don't have a picture of him in a second. Michael Bauer earned the master's degree here, and he is responsible for the largest food and wine staff on any newspaper in the United States. During his career, he and his words and his recipe have influenced millions of readers, and his blog has even added to that number. His most enduring legacy, besides making every other food editor in America jealous, is his impact on food journalism. He was founder and past president of the Association of Food Journalists, and he helped many reporters and food experts polish their writing and reporting skills. One of those was Kim Severinsen, who went on to be the dining writer of the New York Times. Those of us who went through the house of Bauer, she told me, learned many things. For one, the importance of journalistic integrity when writing about food. Michael was instrumental in designing the ethical guidelines for food critics that is widely considered now the standard of the industry. He was also insistent that recipes needed to be thoroughly reported and tested as much as any news story. Now, Bauer came from a food background. He worked at his father's meat market in Chanute, but he never thought food would be his life. As a starving graduate student at K-State, he said, food was never the center of my universe, but he went to the Kansas City Star and was writing about behavioral sciences when he started writing about food. I fell in love with the topic, he said. He went from the Kansas City Star to the Dallas Times-Herald, which is where I first met him, and then to San Francisco in 1996. In 2004, he was inducted into the James Beard Foundation's Who's Who in Food and Beverages in America. He wrote to me, "It is strange how things catch up with you. You feel that you will grow and change, but I learned that what I learned in Kansas still informs what I do in San Francisco." When I asked Michael for a recipe for the book, I was shocked by what he sent. A Chex Party mix. But he did send it with this explanation. Of course, anyone who grew up in the Midwest knows about Chex Party mix, right, Michael? And living in one of the food capitals of the world, in the United States, I figured that I had moved beyond that. About 15 years ago, I found my mother's original recipe, adapted it a bit, and made up a batch for a story we were doing at the Chronicle on retro food. It was designed as a joke. My colleagues laughed, and then they ate, and ate, and ate. My Chex Party recipe has now become a tradition at the paper. Sophisticated, maybe not, he wrote, but good always wins out. All right, what's the difference in his recipe? Bacon fat. In the book, Eating My Words, Reading Women's Lives Through the Cookbooks They Wrote, Janet Theophano wrote that cookbooks are collective memory, identity, legacy, autobiography. Tea Time to Tailgates is like that, collective memory, identity, legacy, and I grew up in Kansas, and there's a lot of personal stuff in that book. Indeed, over 150 years, the K-State campus groups have added to this collective memory as they have published little cookbooks to raise money for scholarships and other student activities. The first cookbook ever produced by the K-State faculty, at K-State, was this one. And it's probably the oldest community-based cookbook in Manhattan. And yes, they did use all those Ks. It was published in 1900, and in it is a recipe for Nellie Kedsey's prune souffle, page 180. Notable Cooks, a project of the Music Guild at KSU in 1976, is more fun than tubas at a pep rally. One of the recipes came from Rona Rounds, who lived in Whitehorse, Yukon. She sent a recipe for how to braise moose meat. The instructions start out like this. Take a walk in the snowy country. Sight moose. Shoot same. Skin, butcher, pack meat, and tote it back to the cabin. I wanted this book to make people proud of their university and their state. I wanted the people to grasp the deep and lasting influence of the university. And I wanted people to read a story and say, I remember that, or that reminds me. I wanted to preserve history and start a conversation and to make connections. But Monday I got a surprising connection. I got an email from Nancy Resnick, And Nancy is a Clovia, was from Clovia and lived in Clovia House, and she got her Clovia sisters together and they sent me the most wonderful stories about Clovia and a couple of Clovia recipes. This is what her email said. I started the acknowledgments in Tea Time to Tailgate and about fell over when I saw the names of your grandmother and your mother. All at once I realized who you were. When my big brother was in high school, he used to give me a quarter on Saturdays to shine his shoes and polish his yellow 51 Chevy hardtop with a white roof because my dad had him working so late that he would have to hurry up to get to Elmdale for his dates. And then she wrote, "Small world." Yes, indeed, it is a small world. Okay. When Least Heat Moon told the story of the Emma Chase Cafe in Cottonwood Falls in his book, Prairie Earth, he wrote about food and community and agrarian traditions. When Timothy Egan described the worst hard times, he described food, farms and ranches and tumbleweeds and salads and canned jackrabbit meat during the Dust Bowl. He wrote about food and community and agrarian traditions. The stories are powerful and telling. Like the food that we eat, each story, each recipe tells us about who we are, who we want to be, where we came from, where we live. In her book, One Amazing Thing, Citra Divakaruni trapped her characters in the basement after an earthquake. One young woman suggested that they tell stories to help themselves pass the time. As they spoke, mysterious things happened. They forgot their fears. They realized how much they all had in common. Don Isaac casts us in a different light when he wrote about bread. Mr. Isaac earned his master's degree in agricultural economics here in 1964. This is what he wrote. There are a number of characteristics of bread bakers that make them unique people in the world. A bread baker always lives in a community with others. You can't bake bread by yourself. You share it with your family, the neighbors down the street, or at a church potluck. A bread baker inherently is optimistic and intimately involved in doing something with hands and simple materials to help others. When I meet a neighbor with bread in hand, I don't have room for a stick or a rock or a missile. I liked his story so much I included it in chapter 4, The Land of Steak and Pie. I'll call this chapter my meat and wheat chapter. Kansas, the land of steak or fried chicken and pie. Meat and dessert. Tea Time to Tailgates turned out more cans than I even expected. It has 13 bread recipes, 31 meat recipes, 28 dessert recipes, green leafy vegetables, Despite dodging green leafy vegetables, Kansas has a rich and diverse food heritage. The state's contribution to the American culinary tapestry ranges magnificently. It's a strange and wonderful mix that I think speaks of our past and our present and our future. And a lot of it is thanks to Kansas State University. After 150 years, the story of food in K-State remains the story of understanding nature, of harnessing science, of making friends, conversation, and memories over a good plate of steak and pie. So the K-State band, the Wildcat band plays on, and professors keep teaching. The researchers keep making discoveries. K-State continues to have an impact on what people around the world put on their tables and on their tailgates. Now, previous Huck Boyd lectures, I have noticed, have imparted tender morsels of advice about good writing, fair and accurate reporting, the responsibility of the fourth estate, and I agree with all those completely. But this is a lecture about food, so I'm going to give you my food advice. Number one, think about this. Food connects everything. Economies, struggles, communications, relationships, politics, policies, health. As M.K. Fisher wrote, first we eat, then we do everything else. Number two, find and preserve your food stories so they won't disappear. Your own kitchen stories. They will be stories about your family and about your homes, about your friends, travels, good times, bad times. Plus, always buy local and always use freshly ground pepper. And save your fork. There may just be pie for dessert. Are there any questions? If you have questions, I think they want you to come to the mic. Yes, if you have questions. Yes, Ron?
What is your very favorite recipe in life?
In life?
And why? Yeah, in life.
Okay. My very, very favorite food in the whole world is my twin sister's cherry pie, which is right up there. And she made this pie for me to photograph for the cover of this book, and then I ate it. She's nodding. Yes, I did not even share it. I worked hard for that pie. Yeah. Okay. Okay. The next question was, which recipe got away, right? Did somebody ask that? The recipe that I really wanted in this book that nobody would give me is a recipe for the pancake mix that the bakery students sell. It has cornmeal in it, just a little bit of cornmeal to give it texture. And everybody promised I would get it, and nobody ever gave it to me. So if it shows up in my email, jpm2@ksu.edu, I'd still like it, yeah. Okay. Well, you can do that or yell, Ann.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I was curious, what, you look at these historic recipes to modern recipes, some of the changes you saw in ingredients, if there were things that were really common back when that have been replaced by something else now.
Yeah, you know, if they were too strange, I didn't use them, except for the crickets and the raccoons and stuff. Some of the recipes, and I indicate in there, some of them are just exactly the way they were printed, like Nellie Kedsey's prune souffle recipe, and some of those. And there are some recipes that you really would have hard, like there's an oyster recipe in there that you'd really have a hard time making today, I think. Most of the other ones have been adapted, like we actually adapted the crown recipe, the K-State crowns, to the bread machine. You know, so some of them are adapted and some of them aren't adapted at all. You can really tell as you go through the book, because they're kind of in order, like on what was trendy at the time. I did vow not to put any Jell-O recipes in the book, which was really hard, and one of these days I'm going to do a whole thing on really strange Jell-O recipes. But you can tell, you can see the evolution of food trends through it. I mean, like there's a recipe in there for mole. Well, nobody would have made mole 100 years ago, you know, at K-State. And the microwave pickle recipe that I talk about was about a 1950s recipe, and it's way too sweet. I mean, next time I make that, I'm not going to put as much sugar, but that's the way they did it then. So I tried to keep them as authentic as possible. Yeah, yeah. They are all tested. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't test the raccoon recipe. Yeah.
So you had to have some kind of culling procedure. How many recipes did
Well, I left out. Okay. How did I choose which recipes to include and which recipes not to include? Well, I wanted to, the Clovia women really wanted me to include Clovia rolls, okay? I didn't include Clovia rolls because I had too many bread recipes, so I snuck it in under the coffee cake. So the Clovia house coffee cake is in there. Hoffman bread isn't in there because I had too many bread recipes. I had too many dessert recipes, but I left them in anyway. I tried to make it as balanced as I could, you know. So there are 2 or 3 soups, 2 green leafy vegetables, several cabbage things. But they all have a historic reason to be there. Now, it may be a really tiny thread of a thread on why they're in there, like the recipe for how to make a pie in a cast iron skillet over a fire outdoors. That's in the first chapter. That came from a woman who teaches pioneer cooking in North Carolina, and her son is a graduate student here. But I really needed a recipe like that to start off with, a real old recipe. So some of the links are like right here. They came from the Union, or they came from Dining Services, you know, or they came from Food for 50 or Practical Cookery, or some of these community cookbooks that I got in the library. But most of them are that way, but some of them are stretching a little bit just because I wanted to include some of those. Yeah, does that answer your question? Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about how long it took you to do this and kind of your process, the whole research thing?
It off and on. How long did it take me? It really took. It took a little more. It took a little more than 2 years. Now that I took time out to plan my daughter's wedding, and then I took time out to do this, and then I took time out because I was just exhausted, and then, you know, some things like that. But more or less a couple of years. I read a lot of stuff, and like any journalist, I way over-reported. You know, I spent days trying to find out what Washington pie was because Anderson mentioned it. Days on it. Well, nobody knows for sure, you know, but it was just too old of a recipe, and he might have just made that up. I don't know. But it was really a lot of fun, and I learned a lot, but it did take a long time. Yeah. Enjoyed it, though. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Okay. If there isn't another question, I'm going to leave you with this little tidbit, and it is a part of a speech that a college regent named Mr. Hoffman gave at the dedication of the Domestic Science Hall in 1899, and the Domestic Science Hall is now Kedzie. The industrialist reported on his speech. This is what he said: "You can live without poetry, music, and art. We can live without conscience and live without heart. We can live without friends. We can live without books. But civilized man cannot live without cooks."
I wanted to go ahead and give Jane a framed poster, and we sure appreciate you being here. You're over here. Appreciate you being here, and thank you all for coming.